Thank you so much, Okan. Thank you for inviting me, for giving me the chance to present today as well. Happy to see some familiar and some new faces. Maybe as a background for you guys, I worked on my master thesis here in collaboration with Okan and Professor Gilles Delaporte during 2020. So it was a very special time. And now I'm happy to be here under more normal circumstances. Today, I'm going to talk to you about current work that I'm conducting together with my PhD supervisor, Professor Maximilian Schiffer, and our co-author, Professor Pedro Amorim from the University of Porto. We will be talking about combinatorial auction design for network returns, and the setting we were looking at is the setting of online retail marketplaces. So let's start with the outline. I will introduce the setting, I will present our methodology, some insights also on a data set that we are able to use, and then the first results of some experiments then we conducted, and then obviously a summary. So now it stopped working. Great. Let's see. Okay, then we will figure it out with clicking the thing. I will just quickly use the mouse so I can actually walk around a bit better. There we go. Perfect. So basically in online retail marketplaces, examples that you might know are Zalando or Farfetch, but also the classical one, Amazon Marketplace. However, we will be focusing more on one of those that are in the fashion retail industry, because this is where we got our data from. Online retail marketplaces have platforms that coordinate the suppliers, which are multiple individual stores and even very small boutiques that otherwise would not be able to offer an online retail store with individual customers. So the suppliers have the benefit that they gain an additional retail channel, while the customers have a lot of benefits, which is also why this is such a popular setting. So they can have a large product range in a one-stop shop setting. It's easy for them to compare the different items. And in order to initiate the business in the settings, they have very buyer-friendly shipping and return policies. This return problem we will be looking at in a bit more detail. In overall, we have also challenges, because nothing good comes without its challenges. The main thing here is that we have a high seasonality for all the products that are sold, especially in fashion. And we also have significant environmental and economical impact or externalities of the shipments and the return shipments. So what exactly is the problem with retail returns? So in the US, 20% of all the shipments that were done were return shipments in 2021, which was an increase from 11% in 2020. So we see a very clear trend here. This results in 16 metric tons of CO2 emissions and nearly 6 billion pounds of landfill waste each year in the US alone. This was the only country that we could get data from. This was the only country that we could get data from, but I think this speaks for itself. In a global retail setting, the goods may pass a worldwide supply network, which means that many of the returns as well as the shipments are carried out via air freight, which is especially critical in this setting. So this basically, as I said, leads to environmental externalities such as emissions, landfill, and general congestion. So just imagine all of the little delivery vehicles that are parked in your street. You could get rid of those, if we solve the problem. Then economical externalities is majorly the resale time reduction. So if you have a lot of seasonal products, when you send them to a customer and they decide to return them, you obviously lose a delta in the selling period in which you could sell the item. And if you sell it later, you have a less likelihood of reselling it, thereby you decrease the resale time and the resale likelihood. Also, the handling and shipment costs need to be taken into account. So there are current some initiatives for customers to reduce the return shipments. Some of them that I found were to consolidate shipments, to charge a return fee, to offer in-person returns, as well as to offer some certain drop-off points for returns. However, all of these are basically already tried out by Amazon, the normal Amazon, not the marketplace, since on the one hand, it depends on the willingness of the customers to modify their behavior. It's nothing that can be reliably carried out by the platform themselves. Then second, these approaches work best if the customers and the store are either close to each other, or you can utilize economies of scale. It doesn't make sense to consolidate 2 shipments. It would make more sense to consolidate 100 shipments, 1,000 shipments within a city or a local, geographical area. And then finally, this is very hard to apply to distributed international retail marketplaces, which is what we're looking at. We will be later discussing why this does not fit particularly well for our problem set, but in general, just consider that this is applicable for something like Amazon, but not, example, Zalando, Farfetch. It won't work for them. So this is why we needed to think of something else. In order to do so, we first looked at the state of the art and the literature gap. So basically, our work relates to 3 streams of literature. The first one is literature on retail marketplaces, which are mostly modeled as 2-sided marketplaces. So there's different approaches to that. Most of the time, the focus is on the suppliers. So how do they work well in the marketplace? How can they make sure that their operations work in an omni-channel setting? Overall, steering with platform-only information has not been investigated for marketplaces. The second stream of literature is obviously retail returns. So basically, people have been studying that having latent return policies leads to more return shipments. But on the other hand, it's also important for the customers to actually accept that they want to shop at your marketplace. So it's, I think it's around 80% of the customers make a very simple return process part of their purchasing decision. Retail returns can be utilized as a resale for open box items or other ways of salvaging the resale value. However, network characteristics for returns have so far not been investigated. Finally, also assortment planning comes into play because of this uncertainty of demand and uncertainty of assortment. However, here also platform information has not been utilized in order to determine the likelihood of some items being sold. This is why we want to investigate how the influence of inherent characteristics of retail platforms, which is the global connectivity, as well as the historical knowledge of the platform operator, and the network-like connections between the individual sellers can be utilized to mitigate or to help mitigate drawbacks on retail returns. Basically, this is where our contributions come in. So we introduce the concept of network returns, where instead of me as a customer directly returning my return shipment good to the original supplier, we also allow for the returns of being bought from the other suppliers in the network setting. So therefore, we utilize the inherent network structure of retail marketplaces to try to mitigate their drawbacks. In order to allow for independent decision-making of those suppliers, we introduce a combinatorial auction setting to match the network returns with the suppliers. And as I already hinted at, we can use a real-world data set to test our hypothesis and to show some potential impact of the network returns. Now I have a toy example of network returns. Here is the buyer 1, which is me sitting in Munich, and the supplier 1 in Montreal. It's also not an unrealistic assumption because the distance is roughly the average distance that a purchase on the platform that we were looking at is being carried out, since the buyers don't know where their goods come from. So I'm just sitting in Munich and I'm thinking about a shoe. What happens, when you're doing research, you think about shoes. I think about the shoe. I know then on the platform that the shoe is with the supplier in Montreal. He can package it and send it to Munich. I now have my shoe, but then looking at it in person, I don't really like the shoe. So now what do I do with it? The obvious solution to a typical return segment would be that I report it to the platform and I send it back. I print out the label, put it with the delivery company, send it back. That's fine. However, there might be another supplier in Portugal that would be interested in selling the shoe in his own store. So I could also send the package back to the supplier in Portugal. For me, it wouldn't change anything because I would just report the return to the platform. The only thing that would change is the address on the shipping label. So now basically the question is, where are we going with this setting? So can we basically quantify this difference in return shipment? Obviously, it's very prominent in this setting, but we will also look into different settings where this might change. Okay, now from going back from this very toy example to a more stylized setting of the combinatorial auction, we will look at not the customer side that we looked at in the toy example, but more in the action space of the platform. So the platform operator serves as the auctioneer in our combinatorial auction setting, and the suppliers serve as the bidders. As you see, the customers are a bit outside. As I said, for them, nothing much changes. They publish the return to the platform, and then it's basically the same as usual. However, for the network returns, some different steps occur. First, the platform publishes valuations for this return item based on the likelihood of resale, which they determine based on the global and historical knowledge that they have of retail demands. You notice here that they do not publish this necessarily to all of the suppliers. We will see later on why this is the case. Then the suppliers submit bids for the returns. They need to at least match the valuation that was published by them. Not all of them also necessarily have to report a bid. They can just say, okay, thank you for the information, but I'm not interested. But they can also overstate the valuation if they have some individual demand that is higher than the valuation that was proclaimed by the platform. Finally, the platform carries out the matching in a combinatorial auction setting and reroutes the winning bids of the network returns to the prospective supplier. So for example, if in here, the supplier valuation was higher than that one, and we only have those two suppliers competing, he will get the return and it will be shipped to him. This setting, matching and everything can be carried out very quickly. So on the customer side, actually, they won't realize what's going on. They will just print the return label with this address. All right. Since nothing comes without its assumptions, I would just quickly want to get them out of our way. We base our study on the following main assumptions. The matching procedure is only triggered in a period when a return is reported, because otherwise, what would we be matching? Then we implement a fully enumerative XOR bidding language where the suppliers can carry out the bundling process. The suppliers also carry out the handling of the returns as well as the network returns, as is usual in the setting. And then every bidder, so every supplier, is eligible to bid on every return. This is especially interesting or especially important if you consider that there could be some legal restrictions. There could be a brand that I cannot sell in my country, but we disregard this. We also disregard stock keeping constraints. So I assume I can still store the item I'm bidding for, just for the sake of simplicity. All right, the second little circle in our little visualization was the decision-making process of the platform, which basically accounts for determining resale likelihoods and resulting valuations. So the platform operator utilizes available historical knowledge on demand data to determine the likelihood of resale for a certain product in a certain geolocation and the individual bidder valuation based on this likelihood. So without going into much detail, we basically have a lot of historical platform information and use a logic regression to fit the remaining demand alpha on information such as the week number, the brand, the product, as well as the country in which it was sold. So right now we're looking at country granularity. We can also go down to city level, but that would be like an extension to the study. The platform then determines the likelihood of resale delta depending on this alpha value. And then finally, they determine the suggested valuation that they think the bidder might have for this item based on the reservation price of the original supplier. So this basically means you're basically looking at the likelihood of resale here, and then the traveling time that it would need to go back to the original supplier. And then as well, you basically discount for the fact that it will take some time and they might lose some value of reselling it. as well as the second consideration is here the respective bidder's valuation, which is the same thing, but for the bidder. Here we say that if the bidder or the supplier on the left-hand side of the picture has a lower valuation than the reservation price of the original supplier, we do not offer this return to him. This was the reason why we do not offer the return to all of the suppliers, because we want to keep the notion of, okay, we do not lose any value of the item by just sending it out for the sake of sending it out. So we only offer it if it makes sense. All right, then the matching process. This is basically a set packing problem. Each time step where we have at least one return published to the platform. This is a very simple problem, which is also why it's pretty quickly to be solved. So basically we want to maximize the overall valuation for winning bids. We need to assign the winning bids to the bundles, the winning bids also to the bidders. The bidders issue at maximum 1 bid per bundle. And then we also need to allocate those returns. Here, the important thing is that we have a maximum shipping distance. Part of the constraint allocates the maximum shipment distance, which basically states that we do not want to ship more than what the original return shipment would be. So if I bought a shoe from Porto, I would not allow to ship it to Montreal to a supplier, even if they were really interested in it. Why this is the case, we will look at in the results, because you can obviously relax this and you can also make it harder. But in the end, there will be a nice way that actually accounts for this formulation. And we only have one set of decision variables, which are binary x's that equal to 1 if a bid is allocated to a bidder in a certain time period. Now, one more little picture of me and the shoe is basically how do we account for the pricing procedure. So now you see this is the typical setting where the customer returns the item to the original supplier and the original supplier returns the full payment. Obviously, there will be some return costs and original shipment costs, but we disregard them. So we're only looking at the actual goods. So this is the normal setting. And then if we look at the network return setting, we have then the bidder in Porto that gets the item, if he's the winning bidder, directly from the customer, as we just discussed before. And then the original supplier nevertheless returns the full payment to the customer. As I said, the status quo for the customer should not change in the setting. And then finally, the bidder pays the original supplier the payment without a certain margin. However, this would also be an extension to the problem. I just wanted to get that out of our way. This is how this setup would be imagined, and it should also lead to additional studies, I think, in the pricing setting. But that's what we're dealing with at the moment. All right. The data set I was talking about. So we have data from a retail platform of fashion and accessories. We have records from 2 years, 2016 and 2017, with a total of around 300,000 observations. Those relate to 1,295 unique suppliers and around 100,000 unique customers. So 18% of all the orders are returned, which is in line with what we know about retail returns in general. And 96% of the returns are out-of-country returns. Why is this so particular? We will look at that also in the experiment section, but just generally for you to know, out-of-country returns are more pricey and are usually conducted in air freight. So this is, again, the setting, okay, we need to take care to reduce the air freight. 60% of all return shipments contain a maximum of 1 returned item. We also see a lot that people order the same item in 2 different sizes because they don't know which size does fit me, especially I think with shoes, if we go back to the example from beforehand. So this is why we want to focus on single item bundles for the following analysis. Basically, for you to just get a bit of an overview of the data set, here's the order basket size. We see that the average basket size, so the items per order per individual customer, is 1.4. So on average, they buy 1 item. If they don't, they might return the other size. If we look at the return shipment distance, it is around 5,000 kilometers. As I said, it basically crosses the Atlantic, which is quite a bit of a distance. And then the return shipment duration is around 9 days. And here we do not look at the time that I need to think about, do I want to return this thing, but actually about the logistics processing time. So if you also take into account that the person still sits at home and considers whether they want to buy the item or not, this would obviously increase, but we cannot account for this because we don't want to actually target the customer behavior here. All right, then let's have a look at the experiments. You remember this little retailers initiatives as part that I presented before. So this is basically me trying to show you why the alternative solution to increased retail returns do not apply for our problem setting. So let's have a look. So at first, the average return shipment distance is around 5,400 kilometers, which equals the distance from Montreal to London in the UK, which basically means that in-person returns or drop-off points are infeasible. That would make not a lot of sense. And then the second argument is that on average, one return per individual supplier per average city in a 2-year data set. Since we have so many different suppliers and since also our customers are spread out so widely around the globe, we basically made a bit of an analysis here where we looked at the different types of cities. So we have the top 3 return cities, which are the cities in which the most returns occurred in our data set. Here, overall, we have between 2,000 and 3,500 returns. However, even in those cities, if we look at the individual supplier, in 2 years, we only have between 5 and 6 returns per supplier. So even if you were to bundle all the data in the 2 years, it wouldn't even make sense to allocate this in that setting. However, if you look at the average city, we only have 9 returns in the data set. It can increase, so it's a bit of it's a very varied data set in that setting. However, on average, we only have 1 return per average city in the whole 2 years that we see. So this then makes it very clear, yeah, so just to highlight those trends again, that shipment consolidation is infeasible, either on the city level or on the supplier level. Okay. Now we wanted to gauge first the impact of network returns in a very high level setting. So we basically had a look at some subsets of returns. So we have men's clothing, men's accessories, women's clothing, and women's accessories. And all of them, we had a look at the return distance that decreased, as well as the increase of the resale value. So we assume that the resale value decreases with ongoing selling seasons. And we also had a look at the matched bids. So among the bids that we offered into the setting, how many of those were actually matched and therefore carried out as network returns. And obviously, we also had a look at the subset characteristics. So you see that for clothing, we have more returns and we also have more brands. So the brands are in the whole data set in general. So this might give you some understanding of the variability of also the data that we have to determine the likelihood of resale. What we see here is that on average, we can reduce the return distance by 93%. We will look into a bit more detail on the next slide, and we can match more than half of the returns that we get. So it's not a forced setting, right? We do not enforce matching them. But if we offer them to the market, there is some benefit from matching them. So this is basically the overall number of returns that we see. And we can say that the characteristics could, or we hypothesize that the characteristics also influence the percentage of matched bids. So basically, you see here that the number of returns is very high for women's clothing, but we cannot match a lot of those. So the hypothesis is that since we have a lot of brand variety in here, it's actually hard to understand the likelihood of this particular item being resold in a certain geolocation, which then decreases the likelihood of it being matched. However, for men's clothing, it works very well, also for men's accessories. However, this is where we have a lower brand variety. So this could already give us some intuition into which applications it might be useful, which marketplaces might utilize the network return setting. All right, and then we also looked at the return shipments distance reduction. So this is for all of those items. So we do differentiate between the women's, the men's, and the clothing and the accessories, but we just do not plot it here. So basically what we do look at here is whether we do not restrict the shipment distance of the matched return, whether we do the distance restriction that I showed you before, or whether we go even stronger and restrict it to a country level setting, where we only allow a supplier to bid for an item if it's returned within his home country. So in the shoe setting, the Portuguese supplier would not be allowed to bid, only other German suppliers would be allowed to bid for my shoe return. And what we see here is that obviously the extremes give us basically the area in which we're looking at. So the number of matched bids and the percentage of matched bids is obviously the highest if we do not restrict the geographical matching. And the average distance reduction for matched returns is the highest if we stay within the country. However, if we look at the no restrictions case, this is basically just the summary of this. So we can match up to 63%, and we can reduce the shipment distance by up to 93%. However, here in the no restrictions case, we have a bit of a weird behavior. So since we're looking at the average distance reduction, the negative value means that on average, we increase our return distance, which is not what we want to do because we want to reduce environmental externalities. So I had a bit of a deeper look into this. Basically, the median distance reduction is positive. So in the median setting, we do reduce our shipment distance. However, 22% of those 265 matched bids actually show an average of 3.4 thousand kilometers increased return distance. It serves us as a benchmark, but I would not recommend to use the no restrictions case because this defeats the purpose of the study. In the following, we will look at the distance, the classical distance restriction that I presented to you in the problem formulation. Another way of looking into this is to just zoom into Europe, for the simple reason that in Europe, a lot of stuff is happening with this marketplace. And here we see that the country restrictions basically give us a smaller amount of returns being matched and also a smaller distance of those having to be returned. And in the no restrictions case, you see a lot more stuff is going on. There's a lot more network returns being matched. However, they're also sent in a shipment with a longer return distance. So this is basically saying, okay, the distance constraints or restrictions pose a trade-off with regards to the amount, the distance, and the valuation of the network returns. The next result is we're taking a deeper look into the women's clothing setting, but this doesn't matter because it also holds for all of the other subsets that we observe. We see that 97% of the matched network returns occur in the second half of the selling season, which basically accounts for a salvaging effect. So basically, by looking in the second half of the selling season, network returns can be utilized to still make the most out of the items that are already there and salvaging their value before the selling season ends. This is also a consideration that I think both the suppliers and the platform should take into consideration when setting up a system like this. And then finally, we also looked at the over-season price decrease and how that influences our settings. So the over-season price decrease is the assumed value by which an item decreases in value, or sorry, the assumed fraction by which an item decreases in value when you compare the start of the selling season and the end of the selling season. So for all the experiments before, we assumed 30% of over-season price decrease, which is coherent with literature. So you can vary this, and we varied it from 20 to 60%, where 60 is a very extreme case. In the first graph, we see the over-season price decrease related to the ratio of the bidder price and the initial price. So basically, as expected, the winning bid prices decrease with a larger over-season price decrease. This behavior is as expected. What I think is more interesting on the right-hand side is the relative average bidder distance and how that relates to the over-season price decrease. So we see a U-shaped behavior which I think is very easily extendable until the 40, because obviously if we have a stronger over-season price decrease, those bidders who are closer to the customer, they might win the bid easier because it takes less time to transport it to them. However, the increase in the right half of the U can also be explained by this over-season price decrease, because with stronger price decreases, less bidders might be willing to actually get the item. If we assume, okay, the price decreases by 60% in the end of the selling season, why would I want to get it? And therefore, the subset of the potential bidders decreases, and the likelihood that the average bidder distance increases again, obviously, also goes up. However, we're still talking about very good distance decreases. So we're complaining on a very high level. All right, now let me just summarize what the preliminary results were. So basically, we can say that on average, we can match 56% of the network returns using our winner determination problem. The average return shipment distance can be reduced by 93% through matching of network returns if we employ the inner country matching. This reduces, obviously, if we relax this. Then most matched returns occur in the second half of the selling season, posing this salvaging capacity. And then finally, the smallest average winning bidder distance occurs for 40% over season price decrease, which would also then determine whether an item is suited to be auctioned off in the network return setting. All right, last slide. I'm very happy to be able to present to you this. And what did we talk about? So basically, at first I introduced to you the concept of network returns. Then we talked about the combinatorial auction winner determination problem to match those network returns. And we had a look at our data set, which allowed us to analyze the potential impact of those network returns on online retail platforms. And I already hinted at some further steps, just summarizing them. Obviously, you can always do more sensitivity analysis, and I think this is also the way that I will go. And then as well, we want to integrate the concept of bundling those returns. So we still think that bundling the returns should be a job that the individual suppliers do, because they know their own demand structure the best. However, you can also think of generating some trade-offs there with pre-bundled items by the platform, or allowing the suppliers to bundle them themselves. All right, thank you so much for your attention. And looking forward to questions and feedback, all of them. Thank you.